Good afternoon and welcome to the Pervasive Media Studio online lunchtime talk. These are live every Friday at 1 p.m, beaming out into your smartphones, laptops, iPads and living room televisions. My name's Luke and I am the Pervasive Media Studio producer. Before we begin, I'd like to say something briefly about the events in Bristol and globally of the week gone by. We've seen historic events happening in Bristol with the toppling of Edward Colston's statue and its journey to the depths of the harbour side. I'm sure a lot of people are thinking hard about how to make useful and meaningful actions now and in the future. For those of you who are watching now and are residents, at 4 o'clock today, there is a resident-led anti-racism working group, which if you get in touch with myself or Joe Kimber, we can tell you how to get involved in that. For everyone else, our Twitter feed is full of a huge number of ways to help, educate, and act. And you can find all of that at PM Studio UK. Back to the lunchtime talks. These talks are a chance for us to throw open the digital doors of the Pervasive Media Studio and for you to hear more from the people who are part of our community or who are working on things that really excite us. And especially big welcome to any of you who are new to the studio, and for those of you who are out there who are new, here's a little bit more about what we do. The PM Studio is a diverse and collaborative community exploring creativity and technology with everything from comedy to coding and product development to performance art. We're a partnership between Watershed, University of West England and University of Bristol. We're a home for early stage ideas and companies and a meeting place of both the creative and commercial industries. We offer studio space, desk space, meeting rooms, events and opportunities, and it's all for free. We are a safe place for artists and companies to take risks in their practice and make time for collaboration. Today's speaker is David Lisser. David is an artist whose recent works imagine the future of cultured meat and the role of technology in food. Today, he's going to discuss the potential, the problems, and the utter weirdness of this fledgling industry. There's a Q&A at the end with the talk running at roughly 35 minutes. If you want to ask any questions, give us feedback as we go, or even just say hello, drop those into the chat window and we'll pick them out as we go. Just make sure you are signed in to a YouTube or Gmail account in order to be able to do that. Next week's talk is called the Homeless Lockdown Diaries, where one of our new residents, Owen Assels, is going to talk to us about how participatory video can be used for empowerment and activism and how we respond to those in an increasingly virtual space. You can get news on all future talks by following us on @PMStudio UK on Twitter or @Pervasive Media Studio on Instagram, or subscribing to our newsletter on our website. Please don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and give this video a thumbs up. The more subscribers we get, the more likes we get, the more we can share stories like this. Please share the link while we're live. We are here for the whole hour and people can come and join us as we go. For now, I'm going to hand you over to David Lisser.
Great, thank you, Luke. Hi everyone, and thank you for having me, Pervasive Media, and thank you for tuning in. I'm David. I'm an artist based in West Oxfordshire, and in 2017 I had the pleasure of spending a few months at the studio, at Pervasive Media Studio, researching and developing a project which was called the Cleanmeat Revolution. And this was an imagined retrospective of the 21st century meat industry. I will talk in some detail about that project and how my work has developed since, but I thought it might make sense to start with a bit of background and a couple of projects that I've done in the past that have kind of dealing with similar themes. So overall, I'd say that my practice is concerned with our relationship with technology, what we think it could do, what it promises to do, what happens when technology becomes product, and how it impacts the way that we think, the way we communicate, the way we live, and, as you'll see, the way we eat. I guess the backdrop to all of this is changing climate. Food technology and the climate are inextricably linked, and so that's kind of like the elephant in the room with all of my work. I suppose the first projects that I want to talk about happened almost 10 years ago now, and it's when I really began to engage in this kind of work. I was based in Allen Heads in the Northern Pennines, which you can see here in England, and it's quite a small population, a few hundred people. It's got a pub, a newsagent, which is a cafe on Saturday mornings, and a surprisingly good contemporary art centre. it also has a lot of midges, which is important for this project. So when I moved there, I basically spent the first little while hanging out with people, getting to know people, getting to know the place, and happily that happens in the pub. We were sitting outside one summer's evening. It was surprisingly nice and warm, and we were sort of maybe a couple of pints in, talking about the future of rural spaces, and kind of ended up talking about the future of rural food production. Allen Heads was originally a lead mining village, so it's too high and too exposed really to grow crops. Some farmers nearby keep sheep, but to be quite honest, they rely on subsidies to be able to do so. And so we're going on this slightly sort of depressing route about the future of rural spaces and the myth of self-sufficiency, whilst simultaneously being eaten alive by these midges. And one guy just said, if we could just eat these buggers, it would be absolutely fine. And as is often the way with art projects, something small snowballs or sparks the rest of the project. And that little phrase stuck with me. And I thought, yeah, okay, let's try and do it. Let's see if we can eat midges. So with the help of a few sort of people who work outside and local kind of rangers, I managed to collect a few bags full of midges, and I made these burgers, which I then very generously presented to the village at a future food cafe that I did at their village fair at the end of August. Cooked up a number of little tasting burgers of midges, which, as you can see, were very well received. For anyone who is interested, they're quite dry. They haven't got much fat in them. Quite a minerally taste, and also quite salty. It's sort of like the seaweed stuff you get around sushi. And although this was like a nice little kind of like experiment to see whether we could eat them, I felt like this had probably a little bit more mileage in it. So I did some more research about insect eating and things like that, and came across accounts of nomadic tribes, primarily in sub-Saharan Africa, who do actually swipe up huge bags full of midges when they kind of emerge from the Great Lakes, and they grind them into flour and stuff, and they make these really highly nutritious cakes for when they are traveling through areas that don't produce any food. And so I began to think about what a nomadic tribe for Northumberland might look like, and came up with this monstrosity, which is the midge catcher's house, a semi-mobile living and midge processing unit. So it had all the kind of like midge catching equipment and grinding and way of kind of like measuring everything out. So it was my sort of like imagined idea about what the future of Northumberland might look like if forced to subsist on its, at that point, indigenous wildlife. One of the interesting things about putting this talk together is that I've seen some connections between projects that seem very obvious now, but I hadn't really thought of so far. And I suppose if this midge catcher project was a rather silly but also kind of serious approach to future food security, and done in a rather DIY aesthetic, a very similar thing could be said about a project that I did in 2018 with Gateshead-based artist called Lucian Anderson. And similarly, just as the chap mentioning the midges sparked the last project, reading an article about the Svalbard global seed vault sparked this one. This is the seed vault, looking like some sort of Arctic Bond villain lair. It is essentially a backup for numerous seed libraries around the world. So there are quite a few kind of national libraries that keep seed stocks, and then this is the place where they kind of bank them all. just in case anything happens to their stocks. It's owned and run by the Norwegian government, and the website is quite interesting. The language they use around it is quite doomsday-ish in a way. So yeah, they say that the vault is the ultimate insurance for the world's food supply, offering options for future generations to overcome the challenges of climate change and population growth. It will secure for centuries millions of seeds, representing every important crop in the world today. It's the final backup, which is dramatic language. Now pay attention to the changing climate bit, or climate change bit, because the newspaper article I read was basically a report of it flooding. It is buried under permafrost, and in 2017 the permafrost began to melt, which entered into the tunnel of the vault. Thankfully, no seed stocks were damaged, but it did represent that perhaps this kind of idea of keeping stuff safe for centuries had been short-sighted in its outlook. And in fact, the Norwegian government's response was, well, it was honest. They said that it was not in their plans to think that the permafrost would not be there, which I suppose is fair enough. Perma gives you the idea it might be there for some time, but if you're trying to think centuries ahead, that seems a little bit limited. And so Lucian and I were sort of discussing this idea about failed safes and kind of silo mentality to backing things up. Now, I think we need to say that we both agree that the vault is a good thing, but that perhaps it should be complemented by other ways of doing this. And we thought about maybe something a little bit more community-based, a little bit more lo-fi, a bit more DIY, essentially dispersing seeds as a way of keeping them, which is kind of exactly what nature does. So we built this, which we called Last Ditch Attempt. And this is our mobile seed library built out of a number of donated bicycle frames and a Morrison's shopping trolley. And in the front, in the basket, you can see numerous seed capsules, which look like this. And these are sealed plaster seed capsules with seeds inside and instructions on how to plant those seeds, but also how to harvest them and then keep those seeds for future pollination, basically future seeds. They were all vegetables and things that were likely to grow in the northeast of England, which is where this project originated and where it kind of was, the cycle around. So we did several kind of iterations of this, and we made a lot of these capsules. Here's one of the production runs in my studio. And I really love doing this project, but I must admit, I'll be quite glad if I never have to cast one of these again, because these all had to be cast by hand, and it got a bit boring by the end. Anyway, we cycled around places in the northeast, Gateshead, Newcastle, Middlesbrough, other places in Teesside. We went to shopping centres, allotment associations, car parks, other transport hubs, and talked to people about seed saving, about the seed vaults, and sort of invited them, if they wanted, to take a capsule and become what we would call a seed guardian, someone kind of keeping these seeds for the future. Now, we had initially kind of discussed how we might instigate or manage a seed sharing network, but we realized quite soon that we would have to essentially take responsible for maintaining that, and then therefore the network would be reliant, at least initially, on our management of it, which essentially provided the same weakness as this central point of the silo mentality of the seed vault. So after a little bit of looking into systems that we could have used, we actually decided not to try and set up a network properly, but to have trust as part of the project. And so this kind of just meant handing over these seed capsules to people and saying, do whatever you want with them. And we know, well, the law of averages suggests that some of these will have ended up in the bin, which is a shame. But we also know from anecdotes and so on that actually quite a few people have kept them, and they are keeping them for a long time. Some of them were smashed open and the seeds were planted, which is absolutely great as well. But we did find that a number of people were quite happy to keep theirs intact. And so although this was not like a academic proposal for future seed storage, this is a happy situation now where in the northeast of England there are a few hundred seed capsules in various places sort of being looked after by these self-appointed guardians, which is yeah, quite a nice thought. So yeah, that's just very quickly 2 projects that I've done in the past that might give you a bit of a flavour of how I work. The project called the Cleanmeat Revolution was, as I said, at Pervasive Media Studio in 2017, and focused on the idea of the future of lab-grown or cultured or clean meat. And I thought perhaps I might do a little bit of a primer on this, because people will have varying degrees of familiarity of what it is. So yeah, it's got lots of names: in vitro, lab-grown, clean, cultured, cultivated. It will probably get more names as it goes along, because people are endlessly trying to find the right name for this product that doesn't sort of actually exist yet. But simply put, it is meat grown in a laboratory. It's not plant-based. It is actually on a biological level meat. It's just grown outside of an animal. So how does this work? A little caveat here: I'm not a tissue engineer. I'm not a scientist. So although I've taken pains to try and make sure that this is accurate, I'm keeping it fairly kind of like overview. If you want to know more in the nicest way possible, do your own research rather than trusting me. So yeah, cultured meat. Essentially, it starts with a biopsy from a living animal, and starter cells are identified and isolated. The challenge is to find the right kind of starter cells, really, because you want ones that proliferate, which is grow very quickly into other cells, or but you also want them to be the right type of cells. Now, meat is mainly muscle, so you want to be making lots of muscle cells happen. Embryonic and adult stem cells both proliferate very, very quickly, but it can occasionally be tricky to kind of direct them to become the right type of cell. Muscle cells obviously only become muscle cells, but they don't proliferate at the same rate. So people do it very differently, but myoblast cells are commonly used, and they're like a pre-muscle cell, is my understanding of it. If there are any tissue engineers watching and want to correct me on a few things, add it to the comments, and I'm sure that Luke will bring those up. Then they are fed with a serum, with a growth media, and for a long time the industry has sort of been reliant on something called fetal bovine serum, which is what it sounds like. And it's expensive and definitely problematic if you're trying to make cultured meat animal friendly. Many companies have now moved past this, and they're finding different ways of feeding and growing the sera. I think this is kind of still obscured a little bit by patent and IP law, so I don't know actually what these are comprised of. But it's been an area of major research to leave fetal bovine serum behind and find a better way of growing the meat. So once they are fed, they're put onto scaffolds or in suspension in a bioreactor, which kind of like acts as the vascular and the kind of homeostasis system in humans or in animals. So it supplies food and oxygen, removes waste, and combats bacterial infection. And then once they've grown to a certain amount, they are arranged to become live meat. And that last sentence hides thousands of hours of people work sort of trying to make this these cells become meat. It's an area of very active research at the moment, and to be honest, it's probably one of the big barriers, along with cost, of cultured meat coming to market. Now, you may have seen this photo at some point. This was from 2013 and is the first time that cultured meat got its like really big airing in the mainstream press. A Dutch researcher called Mark Post had been growing in his lab with his colleagues the first cultured meat burger, and he cooked it up and presented it to journalists at this big sort of PR event. Now, it's not actually the first time that cultured meat had been eaten. That was done almost a decade earlier by artists Oren Katz and Jonet Zer, who run Symbiotica, which is like a bio-art lab. And they had cooked frog leg cells into a steak format and fed them to curators and other art people at an exhibition. Either way, this is the first time that a burger had been cooked. And this, I find this really interesting because this image gives you this idea that like this, basically you put some cells into a Petri dish, feed them for a bit, and then, oh, look, a burger, how convenient. But that's utterly false. This is a small selection of the amount of vials and cylinders and things that were grown to eventually be combined to make this burger. So, but Mark Post, when he was doing it, basically he'd only grow one cell thickness at a time, and then they were kind of lifted off, combined into this big sort of mush. It's the technical term, and then minced up, and then popped in that Petri dish, well, essentially for a photo opportunity. And I do find this really interesting because it's kind of this big divide between what we are shown about cultured meat and kind of what actually happens. So maybe I wanted to talk about why people are doing it, what are the motivators or benefits of it. Reducing animal suffering is a big driver, although we still need living animals to take biopsies from. Broadly speaking, most animal rights groups are largely supportive of this, as biopsies can be done fairly painlessly, and cultured meat doesn't have a nervous system and can't, from our current understanding, experience suffering. Obviously, moving beyond an animal-based serum or growth media is like a requisite step for this to be fully accepted. But that's one of the primary drivers. But environmental factors is probably what got me most interested to begin with. There was a landmark study in 2011 that suggested that compared to conventional livestock rearing, cultured meat could produce the same amount of food for 45% less energy, up to 98% less greenhouse gas emissions, up to 99% less land use, and very similar figures for water use reduction as well. Which, like, if true, could be astoundingly good news for the planet and for the environment. However, and there always is a however, this was done a while ago and is essentially a speculative kind of life cycle study of an industry that didn't yet fully exist. And so assumptions had to be made. Some of those have proven to be erroneous in the course of time, and it's this area is still ongoing in terms of like people trying to project what the environmental impact would be. Greenhouse gas emissions and energy use are the ones that people are debating the most, but basically land use and water, most people seem to be saying that yes, there will be a huge reduction in that, which if you could free up a huge amount of land and use less water, that's very good things for reforestation, for energy production, for a number of positive things for our climate. Health is yeah, quite a big one as well. And I kind of suspect that we might see an emphasis on this. Well, I don't know. We may see an emphasis on this post-COVID, because cultured meat is grown in a sterile environment. You can't actually have cross-species infections happening, like it won't stay into the food chain, because it's not an animal, so it can't pick up like pathogens or whatever. The flip side of this is that because it isn't an animal, it doesn't have an immune response. So if somehow a bacterial infection did get into a bioreactor, it could grow fairly unchecked. So some industry leaders are possibly suggesting that if this does become a scaled industry, we'll need clean rooms where essentially humans don't work in them, using robotic technology to do all of the work of keeping the bioreactors going. We could also add beneficial things to the meat in a very similar way to how B vitamins and thiamine and stuff is added to breakfast cereals, because we know that eating huge amounts of processed meat currently is very bad for you. And then there's one final factor which isn't talked about that much, but I suspect is a big motivator for a lot of people, and that's money. The global meat industry is huge and getting bigger every year. We like to think that, in the West, some countries are showing some shift towards a reduction of meat consumption, but that is not the global picture. So if $1.4 trillion annually, like even a small proportion of that could make someone very, very wealthy, which is why it's a big motivator. And when is it going to happen? Well, no one really knows. For the past 7 or 8 years now, I reckon, people have been saying, in 2 years' time. It would be a mug's game to guess. Interestingly, the first time it seems to come up is in an article that Winston Churchill wrote, actually, in 1932, which was called 50 Years Hence. So he expected these to be in the early 80s, which is not, not the case. So there's some of the science. If I have said something wildly inaccurate and someone watching knows, then please say. So on to the art. In 2017, I worked at the studio to basically put together this idea of a future museum retrospective. So this is the idea of looking at the years 2030 to 2080 as if they had passed, and we were looking at artifacts from that time. Although it was very much focused on meat, and that was its central subject, I wanted to paint a bit of a picture of the society that gave rise to this and why it kind of came to the fore at the time that it did. So I made a number of imagined objects of social history, such as these Right to Rain t-shirts, which describe basically from imagined protests where a world of flash flooding and drought essentially was happening in these cycles and decimating lives, and that because it was due to anthropogenic climate change, it was seen by some people as a violation of human rights, and the right to reasonable weather was being trampled upon. Interestingly, there are certain provinces within China, because China do a cloud seeding program, which, if you don't know what it is, Google it, it's fascinating. Certain provinces have accused other provinces of stealing their rain, or cloud theft, as they call it. So that was kind of based on that and taking it to the nth degree. There was a Hans Rosling style economics lecture, which sort of looked at, on video, that looked at how the clean meat market fluctuated throughout its time. There was this thing, which was a clean meat massager, or an excavated part of a clean meat massager. The idea being that because the meat isn't an animal, it isn't being exercised, and therefore might not develop the right sort of texture. So I made this kind of piece of industrial machinery that had been dug out of the ground and presented in this manner, and then made a little sort of science museum style model to show how this might work. Big shout out to Tarim here, who, well, essentially made this work and was also a wonderful sounding board for surreal speculations about the future. And a big thank you to Rhiannon Hall as well, who made the wonderfully grotesque sort of meat texture membrane there. And the whole exhibition was presented this museum style, and each piece had labels that would kind of like historicized them and kind of built up this bigger picture. It was based in, I didn't say what it was in We the Curators, which is a science centre in Bristol. And although it was very clear on the outside that this was art and not real, the staff did report afterwards that a number of visitors had come to them very concerned that they had never heard any of this in the mainstream news and wanted to know when it had happened and why it wasn't being talked about more, which is both a little bit worrying, but as an artist, very satisfying. So I felt very happy with that. So yeah, what I've been doing since then? Well, this project for me, like, it is definitely the start of something which will become a very long body of work, really. I'm absolutely fascinated by this industry, and I've kind of been working on it ever since, with a little break to look at the last-ditch attempt piece that I showed earlier. I mentioned that three-dimensionality in meat, trying to like make it into meat texture, is a major challenge. And there's like numerous approaches that people are taking for it. I just find this very fascinating as an area, which probably makes sense as someone who thinks of themselves as a sculptor. Particularly the aim of moving from burgers and nuggets and sausages, i.e. already minced up meat, to how we could grow recognizable joints of meat, such as chops or steaks or other cuts like that. So I began to think about how I could like borrow from manufacturing systems that already exist to suggest ways that cultured meat might in the future be grown. So this piece is like a lamb leg sprue. The idea that the lamb legs are grown over time and then harvested once they come to full size, or they're kind of shedding their skin a little bit like snakes and stuff like that. But I was thinking that probably wouldn't work for a really industrialized system that needs high speed and so on. So I thought about injection molding and what that might look like if you were going to force meat into shapes at high speed. And so I made these rubber molds. This one's a sort of lamb chop, and I wanted to make a kind of continuous system so that things could be pumped through it. But also, when I was kind of playing around with it, wanted to reference the arts and crafts movement in its style and how it looks. As you probably know, the arts and crafts movement had quite a strange and inconsistent relationship to technology and machinery. On the one hand, they kind of decried mechanization for its soulless repetition of form, but they also needed it to make some of the things that they wanted. And actually, some members of the community had a really utopian idea about what factories could be, and that mechanization could mean a huge reduction in the working week, which would allow people to spend their time on personal betterment rather than working for a living. So I've been playing around with ideas about this, and a scenario that I'm still working on, to be honest, recently kind of playing around with sort of prosthetic techniques of painting silicon to get a more kind of lifelike positive from the negative form. And then since lockdown, I haven't been in the studio, so I've been trying to learn digital modeling as a way of proposing new meat stuffs. So this is a digital render that I made of thinking about how we could grow lamb chops on stems, similarly to how mussels are grown on ropes or something like that, and kind of placing it in this cold storage room. And I did actually get around to making a sort of scaffold sculpture of what this might look like and how the meat could be trained on this form and then harvested from there in a way. And I understand that from a commercial point of view, mimicking existing meat is probably the best way of ensuring good sales. But I do think that if we do end up with this ability to grow meat in whatever form we can, then it would be kind of unimaginative to stick to known joints or whatever like that. And so I think there's like culinary advantages that could be had if we could play with this a little bit. And so I've kind of been designing these sort of origami, mathematical shape salmon pieces and things like that. And also thinking about how we might grow meat onto pre-existing organic forms, which would use a technique that I always struggle to say, but it's called decellularization, which is essentially where you flush out all of the organic material from an organic structure, and then you are left with essentially what's holding it together. So in plants, it would be cellulose. In other things, it could be collagen. And this is an area that tissue engineers are currently looking at in both regenerative medicine, but also for cultured meat. So this is a spinach leaf that's sort of been flushed out of all this, living stuff that's been flushed out, and it's just been left with its structure. And I'm not sure whether this photo is like a mock-up with dye or whether it's real, but there are scientists in the States who are growing human heart tissue onto spinach leaves as a way of sort of getting them to grow better. So I decided I might play with this a little bit as well, using the digital techniques, and used scans of extinct mollusks, and then re-presented them and re-showed them as potential future meat forms. I just liked doing it, and I thought it was something quite nice and perverse about using fossilized forms as scaffolds for future consumption. And I suppose on this point of it looking weird, that's something that's quite interesting about cultured meat, is that without getting into too much detail about what is natural and what isn't, everything that's considered to be unnatural or too scientific is often hidden when talking about cultured meat. Hence the idea of the burger being in this petri dish really beautifully and neatly. And so I've begun to think recently about how cultured meat might be advertised when it actually comes to market. Now, because there aren't any products available at the moment, there's nothing really to look at in terms of that. When you go to cultured meat companies' websites, they're very clean, glossy-looking things that put forward what they are hoping to do. But I did come across something that was very close to an advert, and it was actually a really fascinating image. So for the last kind of 10 minutes or something, I'm going to look at this image and talk through my thoughts about it and how we can maybe, using the form of an advert, reframe what cultured meat could be. Yeah, okay, I suppose, moving on. So this is the advert, in inverted commas. It was part of a tweet from the CEO of a company called Just, who are based in the States. And this was the accompanying text in the tweet, sort of laying out the history of meat consumption and how it's changing. And I thought this was just an absolutely fascinating image. First up, the ridiculousness of hunting a chicken nugget is quite apparent. But as is the way of humour, it sort of allows you to slip in quite a few other things without people realising. So although the chicken nugget is formally in the centre and it kind of grabs your attention, I feel like the spear is actually the more interesting part of the story. I mean, obviously it is this kind of long, phallic, stabbing, skewering thing, which I would suggest is there to reassure certain types of men that cultured meat is still meat and therefore fits with their depressing and damaging views of masculinity. But it also suggests like a historical continuity and a linearity, which is backed up by the text, trying to lay out that cultured meat is part of our human development. And when I saw this, I was reminded of a text by a sci-fi or speculative fiction writer called Ursula Le Guin, who wrote a lot of incredible books and essays in the latter half of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st. And she has an essay called The Carrier Bag Theory of Fiction, which perhaps some people are familiar with. In this, she borrows from Elizabeth Fisher's theory of human evolution, which basically states that the earliest cultural device was probably not a spear or a bone used to bash someone over the head or something like that, but more likely to be a bag, a carrier bag. Because in the temperate world, at least, hunter-gatherers relied much more on gathering than they did than hunting, and gathering without a bag is very inefficient. So, yeah, she basically uses this as a different way of explaining human culture and the earliest cultural device. And Ursula Le Guin picks up on this and takes it a little bit further about identity and about storytelling. So she says, so long as culture was explained as originating from and elaborating upon the use of long, hard objects for sticking, bashing, and killing, I never thought that I had or wanted any particular part in it. Evidently, I was extremely defective as a human being, or not a human at all. And then she takes this idea a little bit further and basically explains how this spear narrative has become the shape of stories and how this has predominated the idea of storytelling throughout time as well. So the hero has decreed that the proper shape of a narrative is that of an arrow or a spear. Starting here, going there, and thok, hitting its mark, which drops dead. I would say that the natural shape of a novel might be that of a sack or a bag. A book holds words, words hold things, they bear meanings. A novel is a medicine bundle, holding things in a particular powerful relation to one another and to us. And if anyone wants to read this essay, it's amazing, it's brilliant. Just go and do it this afternoon. And I would suggest that when we look at this advert, it is very much adhered to the hero narrative of technology. We started with spears, then industrial machines, and now we have cultured meat. So this is the line, and this is the target, and we're hitting it. And to kind of stretch the analogy further, for the tribe waiting in the cave or the consumer, the story hasn't really changed in any way. We still buy, although these heroes are far away, kind of in distant laboratories doing, heroic things with cell lines and all that sort of stuff. For us, we still buy packets of meat from the supermarket that tell us nice little tales about how good they are and how we've made the right choice as consumers. and all that sort of stuff. And so I've been wondering, is this the kind of future we want? Is cultured meat that limited? Is it just another way of making meat, or could it be something more than that? And I wanted to think about maybe whether we could move away from a heroic narrative towards some sort of carrier bag reading. Now, this is all kind of like fairly recent thoughts, so they're not completed, but I thought this might be a good place to put some of these out there and see what people think. But I feel like a different way of using cultured meat could become something a bit more communal and a bit more expansive, that doesn't just see technology as a target hitting exercise, but that recognizes that technology inherently carries this bundle of relations and meanings. And in my reading, I've come across one approach that sort of could fit that, and I think probably needs a bit more real world experimentation if we can. And that's a thought experiment done by a bioethicist called Cor van der Wiel, and it's called Pig in the Backyard. And broadly, there's pig in the backyard. Broadly put, it's the idea that you keep a pig or whatever animal you want to eat in your yard, or maybe communally as a street, and it lives a really good life. You know, it eats, sleeps, has freedom, walks around, meets other animals, children pet it, animals care for it, adults care for it. But every so often you take a biopsy and you pop it in a vial and you head down to your local community run laboratory, which I'm currently calling Carnecopia, just for my own amusement. And the collective grows some meat for you, and you pop back in a couple of days and pick up your 24 pack of bacon or whatever. And these carneries would function like a communal bakery. There'd be a social aspect to it. And in this scenario, which is by no means complete, I suppose the actual technology would still have an element of this like heroic story about it, but actually the use of it and the implementation and the ownership would be much more communal and much more held, and a lot closer to home, and would probably have a very different impact on us socially if we are kind of living with these animals that we are not eating, but eating from. And it puts you in this really strange sort of place to do with your relationship with food and animals. And I accidentally said the word pet earlier, and I don't know if you would consider this to be a pet. And if you did, then you'd probably have to reconsider your approach to, if you have any pets, whether you would eat from your dog or yourself, perhaps. You know, talk about self-sufficiency. Why not harvest, take a blood sample and then like pop it in a vial and grow it for a bit? You know, kind of this, it could be quite a revolutionary way of thinking about food. There's probably a lot of ethical boundaries that I've just jumped over there. So I'm not necessarily condoning auto-cannibalism. But I also think, thinking about this, the language around it would change quite a bit as well. If you look at the language of gardening, for example, against the language of industry or agriculture, you tend to plants and you nourish the soil and you train seedlings and all that sort of stuff. And if we had this pig in the backyard, the language probably would be one of care rather than one of control. And it's not to say that we don't take from it, but we don't benefit from it. We still eat plants that we grow in the garden, or some people do, or people grow flowers for their own aesthetic pleasure, but the language is not one of extraction of natural resources. It's still the same stuff, it's just the language is completely different. And even the subtle difference between the idea of produce and product can have implications for how we relate to the subject. And so, this is, as I said, not a fully completed scenario, but I think it's one that seems promising in terms of addressing concerns about industrialized farming, whether that be conventional industrialized livestock agriculture or cultured meat. But also continuing to feed people and continuing to maintain animal-human relationships. So if anyone, watching wants to talk about it more, I believe that after this is finished, some contact details or something will come up. So please get in touch. Now you know that I called this talk Carnecopia, mainly just due to a weakness to a bad pun, but also about concerns of cultured meats being co-opted into basically a new form of overconsumption. You know, the cornucopia, the horn of plenty, it describes abundance and nourishment, but like not excess. And despite what various cultured meat companies are saying and have been saying, this meat is not here yet. It's not here now, or not in the market anyway. And so I think we've got quite a crucial, but probably fairly short window where like imaginative interventions into this could direct cultured meat into a technology that is really quite broad and much more fulfilling in scope than what could sadly be like a perpetuation of tech-enabled greed. That's my piece. Back to you, Luke.
Just going to unmute myself. I did a little bit of talking there with myself on mute. I think everyone's experienced a bit of that at some point in a Zoom call in the last few weeks. As I was saying, thank you so much. There was so much packed into those last few sentences that I could just come up with a load of questions on my own there. But there are a few already from our audience. So I want to kick off with Martin's question. Martin asks, what do you think cultured meat has over fake meat that are made from plants or fungus? Is it just an aura of authenticity?
Yes. I don't know. I think it probably depends if people can get to the point where you are growing steaks or like complex forms of meat from cultured meat. If you can get to that, I reckon it probably will mark a real difference. Personally, the plant-based kind of burgers that are out there are like really good. But I think for a lot of people, it probably is just the aura around meat. But I don't think that's going to go away.
Yeah, it's a deeply ingrained part of a lot of people's lives, right? So Nia asks, I wondered if part of your project was to do with creating a psychological change for people, like making them think more about themselves as nature's guardians and looking out for future generations? Question mark.
The question mark. Oh, absolutely. Sorry, I thought that was a statement about my work.
It was all my tone there. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely. Although I do tend to get very drawn into the detail of the subjects that I'm looking at. Overall, I do think it's about trying to ask questions about responsible ways of living, I suppose, really, whether that's technology or whether that's meat, and to help people move past the kind of simple questions and maybe rethink what their relationship with the world is and essentially what they want the future to look like. So I'd say that question was a spot on analysis.
Fair enough. Jo Lansdowne asks, she says she's interested in Nia's question as well, and in what ways that, as well as ideas around growing or sculpting meat, relate to problematic ideas of us being separate to nature rather than part of it.
Oh, can you say that again?
Right, yes. In what ways that, as well as ideas around sculpting meat, relate to problematic ideas of us being separate to nature rather than part of it? So it's about our relationship between the environment and the kind of, I think Jo is talking about where we see ourselves as kind of a completely separate entity that has no impact whatsoever.
Yeah. I suppose it's kind of a lot to do with consumption and food, especially when we have what many project to be a growing population of 9 billion or so by 2050. That's a common figure that's banded around.
Jo has just clarified the question, which might make it easier to answer. She says, if we are guardians of nature, does that suggest we are not part of it?
That's a good question. I think we are a part of nature, but a lot of people basically disagree and probably act as if they are guardians and have sole responsibility for the future of nature. And I think we can see from past human endeavors and experience that our footprint on nature is heavier than other members of nature. And so I think we do have a responsibility to care for this thing that we are a part of.
Yeah, too right. We're running out of time, David. I'm gonna throw a question into the mix just in case there's anyone typing a question as we speak. But could you talk a little bit more about anything you found in your research about humans making meat from themselves?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where people like throw it in as like a cheeky little question because they think they're being really I don't know, disruptive or whatever. Not you personally, but it doesn't have a history of like, this sort of like, oh, we can eat ourselves, without actually thinking through it. Because I think as long as you steer away from brain matter, eating human brain matter is definitely bad.
Good to know.
Yeah. I think that I think it should be more seriously thought about. And actually the details are very thin on the ground, which is why I really didn't make it part of the main talk, but I am talking to an artist who has done a lot of work with her own DNA in the past and encoding messages into her own DNA and things like that. And she is interested in the prospect of growing her cells onto a structure that perhaps I might have some part in designing, with the aim of eating it. There will be a number of technical and ethical issues and years of work, I imagine. But I think it is an area that recently people are beginning to take a little bit more seriously about whether it actually is a viable way of producing food or whether it's deeply wrong.
I would, if you ever want to come back and talk about that project and she wants to join you, would be delighted to host that.
I'll let her know, yeah.
I think we're out of questions. So, very quick one there. Pete Bennett says, are artificially grown midge burgers on the cards?
As far as I know, no one is focusing on that yet because the market for non-artificial midge burgers is not yet fully saturated. But the people of Allen Heads, I'm sure, will be keen to support this new venture.
So Pete, get in touch with David. You can make some artificial grown midge burgers together. David, I want to say thank you again. Thanks for taking time out this afternoon.